Most people argue about buying versus renting without ever running the maths. So today, that is exactly what we are going to do. But before we get going, welcome back to the channel. My name is David. I don't actually have a name for my channel yet. So if you've watched a few of my videos before and you want to name the channel for me, drop it in the comments below. I am taking all suggestions because I am fresh out of ideas. It's the argument that everyone's parents love having. Buy your home, pay it off, hold it forever, but the reality is that is just simply not how the game is played anymore. So today, I want you to ignore emotion for a second and let's look purely at the numbers. Because if you've watched any of my videos before, you would know by now that when you buy property, whether it's a home to live in or a property that you want to invest in, you need to make both an emotional and a financial decision. So let's look purely at the numbers. What we're gonna do is build together a scenario of a couple on an average Australian income. This is that little scenario here. We have our income of $200,000 combined. We have a deposit of $90,000. And in their debt position, we only have HEX because everyone has HEX. And we are also paying rent of $650 per week. And the reason I've chosen this avatar is because I feel like it's a very representative position of a lot of people who watch my videos. So what we're gonna do is run the numbers side by side for buying to live in versus buying to Rentvest. So this is how it all stacks up. For the owner-occupied scenario, as you can see, we've got our income, we've got our deposit, we've got the liabilities we need to worry about, and we need to ignore the rent that we're paying because we're going to be moving into a home to live in. Now, looking at this, we're going to have a capacity for a loan to a total of $930,000. That's on a loan basis only. But as you would know, we need to balance up both income and security when it comes to buying properties to live in. So for this, because we have a relatively low deposit with $90,000, we're going to be using the home guarantee scheme. That is the 5% deposit scheme that the government will guarantee your loan and allow you to leverage up to 95% of the property's value. When we run these numbers on our calculators, essentially what we are able to do is purchase a property that is worth $810,000. We would have an outstanding loan of $769,500, and we will be paying this at around a 5.75% interest rate. That's what's going to be average at the moment, especially just after the rate rise that we got in February. So because we are using the home guarantee scheme, we are not paying any lender's mortgage insurance. That's important because we're going to touch on that a little later in the video, but we do have some other costs because we're doing the scenario here in Victoria because this is historically the most expensive state to be buying in. So our stamp duty for this property here will be around $44,000, not exact, we're just doing some quick numbers. We also have some other costs such as mortgage registration fees, transfer fees, and as well, I like to budget around $3,000 for extra costs. That's your conveyances and building and pest inspections and things like that. So roughly, we're gonna be doing around, let's call it $50,000 in costs. The costs aren't a huge bearing on the scenario at all, but this is roughly what happens when you're going ahead to buy the property to live in. When that is all said and done, the number that we need the most is going to be the repayment for our $769,000 loan. That there is going to be $4,490 a month. We've increased our rent from $650 a week to, let's call it $4,500 per month. So let's keep that number in mind and let's now build out the rent vesting scenario together. So rent vesting, we have the same avatars as before, the couple earning the $100,000. I'm not gonna do my cute little drawings again. It takes me way too long to do that. So what we're gonna be doing, we need to take into account our $650 a week in rent. But because we are going to be doing everything on a monthly repayment, I want us to have the rent at $2,816 a month. It's gonna make a lot more sense a little bit later on. So after all is said and done with our $90,000 deposit and running our borrowing capacities as well, we can actually lend a little bit more even though we're renting. But when we run everything together and we weigh up the security as well as the income, this leaves us with the capacity to buy a property for $640,000. Okay? You might say, David, that's way lower than the $810,000 property. Yes, that's how numbers work. However, this is how we build up an investment portfolio if this is the way that you want to go. Now, of course, we're doing this at a 92% base loan to value ratio, which means we're going to be getting a loan at 92% of the value of this $640,000 here. We are going to need to pay lender's mortgage insurance on this property. we need to make sure that once we capitalize our lender's mortgage insurance, that this number here does not go above 95. So the LMI in this scenario would be roughly around $19,000. So when we add everything together and we get our final loan amount, it's going to be around $608,000, which is exactly 95% of our $640,000 purchase price. Of course, we've also included all of our other costs such as stamp duty, building and pest inspections, and all that kind of stuff. That's all built into the scenario using the same $90,000. But again, because we're looking at a pure monthly outgoing number here, we're not worried about what the costs actually are. We're going to ignore that for now. Now, what's really important that even at this LVR for investment, we are going to need to do principal and interest repayments, and the rate is going to be pretty high. It's going to be around 6.5%. I ran some numbers with the banks before I started making this video here. That means that your repayment amount on this is going to be around $3,850 a month, which is a wild amount of money for such a small amount of debt. Then, of course, we need to take into account some rental property costs. I like to budget around $300 a month in costs, property management fees, if things break down across the year, on average, $300 a month. That's what I'm going to work with in this scenario here. And then of course, we're going to use a relatively conservative rental yield of 4.5% here in Victoria. We don't rent things out for very much down here. So 4.5% I think is light but fair for the scenario. So this property here is going to rent out for $550 per week. Or because we're doing everything monthly, it's going to be $2,385 monthly. But before we start putting the comparison together, we need to stack up the costs altogether for the investment property. We're going to have our repayment of $3,850. We have our property costs of $300 a month. And then we have the rent that a couple is going to be paying because we're not moving out of the property, remember? So we need to take that into account. That's $2,816 a month. So altogether, this is $6,966 outgoing. And then of course, we need to minus off here this $2,385 a month that we're going to be receiving in rent from our tenants in the investment property. All in all, the out-of-pocket cost is going to be $4,581 on a pure dollar cost. It is more expensive to hold this asset than it is to have an owner-occupied property by $91. So this is $4,581 on our rent vesting scenario. And then we have our $4,490 a month on our owner-occ scenario. And if you looked at this and said, this is the end of the story, you would be incredibly wrong. Now, there are two very big differences when we take out owner-occupied debt and then we take out investment debt. The investment debt of $608,000 versus the owner-occ debt of $769,000 is treated very differently by the tax office. Now, this isn't a tax lesson, and if you want some tax advice, I would strongly suggest you go to your accountant for this, but this is generally what people talk about when they talk about good debt versus bad debt. That's because you can get a deduction on your income for the investment debt, but you cannot get a deduction for your owner-occupied debt. Of course, that is doing things like negative gearing, and if the property is running at a loss, again, if you want some tax advice, please go and talk to your accountant about that. Now, the great thing about buying investment properties is that you don't necessarily need to buy in places you want to live in. You buy in places that make sense and where the numbers stack up and where you're advised to purchase. I have worked with a few clients, and one comes to mind in particular. He bought a property in regional Victoria for $450,000, bought it at a very high LVR, just like in this scenario here. 8 months later, the property has skyrocketed in value. We were able to refinance that property, put it onto an interest-only term at an 80% loan-to-value ratio. That allowed the client to essentially halve their repayments because the interest rate dropped so aggressively, and now that property is cash flowing a lot better for them. So there are a lot of things you can do really quickly to be able to relieve the pressure in an investment property if the property increases in value very quickly. You can't really pull that lever with an owner-occupied purchase under the home guarantee scheme because you already have 80% loan-to-value ratio rates because the banks give you very sharp rates on the home guarantee scheme. Now, this wouldn't be a David property video if we didn't start talking about the emotional side of purchasing property, because I think that is equally as important than the financial side of it. And if we step away from the maths for a minute, the lifestyles look very, very different. If you're renting, you might be renting closer to the city in arguably a better location and have a better lifestyle that suits you. If you're buying to live in at $810,000, you might be a little bit further out. You're probably buying a house or a larger size townhouse. So it's all going to come down to what actually matters to you. And that's why I always talk about property decisions being both emotional and financial, and whichever one of those matters to you the most is usually what's going to drive your final decision. In the end, what's better? Truthfully, neither. It depends entirely on your life and your life specifically. If you want to settle somewhere and stay for 5 to 10 years, buying your first home to live in, that's probably the right move for you. But just remember, moving later can be really expensive. Between the stamp duty you've already paid on the property, the stamp duty you're going to need to pay on the next property that you move into, as well as the agent fees that you have to pay when you're selling, you can easily burn through $100,000 by just moving once. When you compare it to rent vesting, of course, it is less stable because you're at the mercy of your own landlord, but it's much easier to move, and that can suit people who move for work. And the first thing that comes to mind is particularly doctors who end up moving all around regional areas for their hospital placements. People that are considering time overseas or working overseas, there's lots of people doing that now as well with the global economy. There's people that are also not ready to settle in yet. Even if it's in the state that they grew up in, they may want to move interstate. So settling down in their first home doesn't actually make sense for them. At the end of the day, both paths can work incredibly well and both can build you wealth. What matters is understanding the pathway that you're choosing and why you're choosing it. There are so many ways to buy your first home and there's so many ways to invest. The key is mapping out the options properly, because whatever you want to do, there's almost always a way to structure it. If you found this video helpful, please like the video, hit the subscribe button and leave me a comment. Tell me what you loved about it.